Just the wallet, the note said under my plate, and I smiled, because they had no idea what I had already done that morning. The restaurant was everything Vanessa loved: soft golden lighting, white linen tablecloths, a view of the river that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. I had arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, smoothing down the navy dress I'd chosen with care, the one Daniel used to say made me look elegant. "Mom, like you belong anywhere." I suppose I still did belong anywhere. Just not here. The hostess led me to the long table near the windows, where place cards were arranged in neat rows. I noticed mine immediately, Margaret Collins, written in a delicate, looping script. It sat slightly apart from the others, closer to the end. Not unusual, I told myself. Not everything means something. I took my seat, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. One by one, the guests arrived, voices rising in cheerful greetings, the clink of glasses, the light brush of perfume in the air. Vanessa entered last, of course, radiant in a cream-colored dress that caught the light every time she moved. People turned toward her instinctively, like flowers seeking the sun. Daniel followed just behind her, his hand resting lightly on her back, his expression relaxed, proud. He didn't look for me. Not at first. I watched as Vanessa made her way around the table, accepting compliments, air kisses, laughter that lingered just a second too long. She had always been good at that, creating a moment that felt warm and inclusive, even as it quietly rearranged who mattered and who didn't. When she reached me, she leaned in, her perfume sharp and expensive. "Margaret, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. I smiled back. Of course. I wouldn't miss it. And I meant that. Not for the dinner. For what came after. The menus were distributed, wine was poured, and conversation settled into a steady rhythm. I reached for my napkin, lifting my plate just slightly, and that's when I saw it. A small, folded piece of paper, tucked neatly beneath the edge of the porcelain. For a moment, I thought it might be part of the restaurant's presentation, some clever detail, a message from the chef perhaps. I unfolded it carefully. 2 words. Just the wallet. The handwriting wasn't elegant like the place cards. It was quick, casual, almost careless. As if it didn't need to be hidden. As if it didn't need to be explained. I held it there for a second longer than necessary, then set it back down, aligning it with the edge of the table. And I smiled. Across from me, a woman I didn't recognize glanced down, then quickly looked away, her lips pressing together as if she'd caught herself reacting. To my right, someone let out a small, stifled laugh. Not loud enough to call attention. Just enough to confirm what I already understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was placement. Intention. Design. I picked up my glass of water and took a small sip, letting the coolness settle my breathing. Around me, the conversation continued as if nothing had happened. Or perhaps, as if something had happened exactly as planned. Vanessa was telling a story now, something about a recent trip, a boutique hotel in Napa, the way the staff had recognized her name upon arrival. Laughter followed her words easily, like it belonged to her. Daniel nodded along, adding small details, his voice warm, engaged. I watched him for a moment. My son. The boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard, who once cried for an hour because he thought he'd broken my favorite mug. He had always been sensitive. Thoughtful. The kind of child who noticed things. Tonight, he noticed nothing. Or perhaps he noticed everything and chose silence. I wasn't sure which was worse. A server approached, placing appetizers in front of each guest with quiet precision. When she reached me, her hand hesitated for just a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking to the note beside my plate before she set down the dish. "Enjoy your meal," she said softly. I nodded. "Thank you." The note remained where I had placed it, visible but untouched. I didn't need to hide it. Not anymore. A few seats down, I caught a fragment of conversation. "She's always been generous," someone whispered. "That's one way to put it," another replied, followed by a low chuckle. Generous. That was the word they used. It sounded kinder than what they meant. I let my gaze drift to the center of the table, where Vanessa sat, her glass raised slightly as she spoke. Honestly, I just think people should know their role, she said. Lightly, as if discussing something trivial, something obvious. It makes everything run so much smoother. There was a murmur of agreement. I felt the words settle somewhere deep, not sharp enough to wound, but heavy enough to anchor. Know your role. I had known my role for years. I had paid tuition checks without being asked twice. Covered down payments when timing was tight. Funded vacations I was too busy to attend. Each time, it had felt like support. Like love, expressed in the most practical way I knew how. I never asked for recognition. I never asked for a seat at the center. But I had assumed, quietly, perhaps foolishly, that I was more than a function. More than a line item. More than the wallet. I glanced down at the note again, then folded it once more, this time smaller, neater, and slipped it beside my clutch. Across the table, Daniel finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. There was something there, uncertainty, maybe. Or the faintest flicker of discomfort. It passed quickly. He smiled, the same polite, practiced smile he'd been offering everyone else, and turned back to Vanessa. I returned the gesture, just as composed. Just as calm. Because the truth was, nothing that happened at this table could surprise me anymore. Not tonight. Not after the morning I'd had. I reached for my wine glass as Vanessa stood, tapping her fork lightly against it to gather attention. The room softened, conversations fading into a gentle hush. Thank you all for being here, she began, her voice warm, confident. It means so much to celebrate with the people who support me, who believe in what we're building. Support. Believe. Building. Such beautiful words. I raised my glass along with the others, the crystal catching the light. To Vanessa, someone called. To Vanessa, the table echoed. I held my smile, steady and precise, and lifted my glass just slightly higher. To knowing your worth, I said softly, just loud enough for the words to exist, even if no one chose to hear them. The glasses clinked. The laughter returned. And beneath it all, quiet and certain, something had already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. The rest of the dinner moved forward as if nothing had been said and nothing had been seen, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Plates were cleared and replaced, conversations rose and fell like gentle waves, and somewhere between the entree and dessert, the note beneath my plate had already become part of the room's quiet understanding. No one mentioned it, not directly, but it lingered in glances that lasted a second too long, in the way a few guests avoided meeting my eyes, in the subtle shift of posture whenever Vanessa laughed just a little louder than necessary. I kept my movements measured, deliberate, cutting my food into small, even pieces, taking my time as if I had nowhere else to be, as if I were not sitting at the edge of something that had already begun to unravel. Across the table, Vanessa leaned into a conversation about a new business venture, her voice bright with excitement. It is going to be something really special, she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. A boutique space, very curated, very exclusive. We already have investors interested. There was a pause, the kind that invites curiosity. That sounds expensive, someone said with a light laugh. Vanessa smiled, the kind of smile that suggested both confidence and expectation. It will be worth it, she replied. And we have support. Her eyes moved, almost imperceptibly, in my direction before settling back on her audience. Support. The words settled over the table like a quiet agreement. I felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as something familiar, something I had carried so long it had become almost invisible. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, leaning forward. We have been planning this for months, he added. Everything is lined up. It is just about timing now. Timing. I lowered my gaze to my glass, watching the reflection of the overhead lights shimmer across the surface. Timing had always been important to me as well. The right moment to speak, the right moment to remain silent, the right moment to act. This morning had been the right moment. A server approached with dessert menus, placing one gently in front of me. "Would you like to see our specials?" she asked. I looked up and smiled. "Thank you, but I think I already know what I will have." She nodded, a flicker of something like understanding passing across her face before she moved on. I had not always been someone who noticed small details, but over the years, I had learned that the smallest moments often carried the clearest truths. A misplaced glance. A hesitation in someone's voice. A note beneath a plate. I reached for my clutch, feeling the folded piece of paper still resting inside. Just the wallet. It was almost elegant in its simplicity. No explanation. No apology. Just a definition. I wondered, briefly, who had written it. Vanessa, perhaps. Or someone else acting on her behalf. In the end, it did not matter. What mattered was that it had been placed there intentionally, meant to be seen, meant to be understood. And I had understood. "Margaret," a voice to my left said softly. I turned to see a young woman, Emily, my niece, her expression careful, uncertain. "I just wanted to say. I am sorry." Her voice was low enough that it did not carry beyond our immediate space. I studied her for a moment, noticing the way her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the way she avoided looking directly at the center of the table. "For what?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "For everything," she said finally. "You do not deserve that." I held her gaze for a moment longer, then offered a small, reassuring smile. "You do not need to apologize for something you did not create," I said. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, but the tension did not fully leave her. "They think you are going to fund the new business," she added quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Vanessa has been telling people all night." I let that settle, not reacting immediately, not allowing the moment to expand into something larger than it needed to be. "Has she?" I said simply. Emily nodded, her eyes flicking toward Vanessa and then back to me. "She said you always come through. That it is expected." Expected. I considered the word carefully. It carried a certain weight, a certain presumption that something given freely could also be claimed without question. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice steady, calm. She nodded quickly, as if relieved to have said it, and turned her attention back to her plate. Across the table, Vanessa was laughing again, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. He leaned toward her, saying something that made her smile widen, her eyes bright with approval. It was a practice dance, one I had watched for years without fully understanding its rhythm. Now, it felt different. Clearer. The pieces no longer blurred together. They aligned. They made sense. Dessert arrived, delicate and carefully arranged, each plate a small work of art. I thanked the server again, lifting my fork and taking a measured bite. The sweetness was subtle, balanced, the kind of flavor that lingered without overwhelming. I appreciated that. Balance had always mattered to me. Too much of anything, even generosity, could tip into something else entirely. I set my fork down, reaching once more for my glass. Around me, conversations began to shift toward future plans, upcoming events, the next gathering. Vanessa's voice carried above the rest. "We should do something even bigger when the space opens," she said. "A launch party, maybe. Something that really makes a statement." There was enthusiastic agreement, suggestions, excitement building. I listened quietly, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed. If anyone was watching closely, they might have noticed the absence of something. Not anger. Not hurt. Just absence. The absence of expectation. The absence of assumption. The absence of the role they had so carefully assigned to me. Daniel's gaze found mine again, lingering this time, as if searching for a reaction he could not quite name. I met his eyes, offering the same calm smile I had worn all evening. He hesitated, just for a second, then looked away. It was a small moment, almost insignificant. But it told me everything I needed to know. The check had not yet arrived, but I could feel it coming, like the final note in a piece of music everyone already knew by heart. The quiet shift of attention. The subtle expectation. The glance in my direction. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my fingers still, composed. They had already decided who would reach for it. They had already written the ending. And for years, I had played my part without question. Tonight would be different. Not in a way they could see yet. Not in a way they could understand. But different all the same. I lifted my glass once more, taking a slow sip, letting the moment settle around me. They believed they knew my role. They believed they understood the limits of what I would do, what I would give, what I would accept. They believed I would continue exactly as I always had. And I let them believe it. For now. The check arrived exactly when I expected it to, not with any announcement, not with any ceremony, but with the same quiet precision that had defined the entire evening. The server placed the leather folder gently at the center of the table, her movements practiced, neutral, as if she had done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again. For a moment, no one reached for it. The conversation continued, but softer now, less certain, like a performance nearing its final act. I watched the subtle shift ripple across the table. A glance from one guest to another. A brief pause in Vanessa's laughter. The almost imperceptible way Daniel's shoulders stiffened before relaxing again. It was all there, the expectations settling into place without a single word being spoken. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the table, my fingers still, my posture unchanged. I had seen this moment play out before, in different restaurants, at different tables, under different lights. The same pattern. The same quiet assumption. The same ending. Oh, Margaret will take care of it. It was never said directly. It did not need to be. Over time, it had become understood. Reliable. Predictable. Safe. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes flicking toward the check and then away again, as if she had already dismissed it from her thoughts. She picked up her glass, taking a small sip of wine, her expression relaxed, almost satisfied. Around her, the guests resumed their conversations, though I noticed how a few of them glanced toward me, their attention lingering just a moment longer than usual. They were waiting. Not openly. Not rudely. But waiting all the same. Daniel reached for his napkin, folding it once, then again, his movements careful, deliberate. He did not look at the check. He did not look at me. Instead, he turned slightly toward Vanessa, saying something under his breath that made her smile, a small, private exchange that excluded everything else at the table. I watched them for a moment, the ease between them, the quiet understanding that required no explanation. It was not new. I had seen it grow over the years, slowly, subtly, until it became the center around which everything else revolved. Including me. I shifted my gaze back to the check, the leather folder resting exactly where it had been placed. Unopened. Unclaimed. I could feel the weight of it, not in dollars or cents, but in expectation, in habit, in the role that had been assigned to me long before this evening began. Just the wallet. The words echoed in my mind, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost calm. For years, I had accepted that role without question. I had stepped into it willingly, believing that it was an extension of something deeper, something more meaningful. Support. Love. Family. I had not realized when it had shifted, when it had narrowed, when it had become the only thing that mattered. Until tonight. The server returned, her eyes moving briefly from the check to the faces around the table, assessing, waiting for a signal. "Whenever you are ready," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach all of us without drawing attention. I met her gaze and smiled. "Thank you," I replied. She nodded and stepped back, leaving the moment suspended, unresolved. Across from me, the woman who had glanced at the note earlier cleared her throat, reaching for her purse as if to adjust something inside, then hesitated, her hand lingering just above the clasp before she let it fall back to her lap. To my right, someone shifted in their seat, the movement small but noticeable, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension that now sat among us. Vanessa set her glass down, the soft click against the table echoing slightly louder than it should have. "Well," she said lightly, her tone bright, almost casual, "this has been such a lovely evening." There was a murmur of agreement, a chorus of polite responses that filled the space without addressing what remained at its center. I could feel Daniel's attention shift, not toward me, but toward the check, his awareness sharpening, his silence more deliberate now. He knew. Of course he knew. He had always known how these moments ended. He had simply chosen not to participate in them directly. Not to question them. Not to change them. I reached for my glass, taking one final sip of water, setting it down with care. My movements were unhurried, measured, as if time itself had slowed just enough to allow me to consider each step before taking it. I could have reached for the check then. Opened it. Signed my name. Completed the ritual as I had so many times before. It would have been simple. Expected. Easy. Instead, I let my hands rest once more on the table, my fingers lightly touching the edge of my plate, the place where the note had been just an hour earlier. The absence of it felt significant. Noticeable. Intentional. Vanessa glanced at me then, her smile still in place, though something behind it had shifted, a flicker of impatience, perhaps, or uncertainty. "Margaret," she said, her voice smooth, almost sweet, "did you want to?" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. I met her eyes, holding her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, my expression calm, composed, unchanged. "Did I want to what?" I asked gently. There was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just enough to be felt by everyone at the table. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly, her fingers curling around the stem of her glass. "Oh, I just meant the check," she said lightly, as if clarifying something trivial, something obvious. "Whenever you are ready." Around us, the table grew quieter, conversations fading, attention shifting, the moment no longer hidden beneath polite distractions. This was it. The expectation, spoken just enough to exist, just enough to be acknowledged. I let the silence settle, not rushing to fill it, not offering the resolution they anticipated. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words, as if weighing something that had never required thought before. "I see," I said softly. My voice was steady, even, carrying no trace of the tension that now surrounded us. Daniel finally looked at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching for something he could not quite define. I held his gaze for a moment, then returned my attention to Vanessa. "It has been a lovely evening," I continued, echoing her earlier words, my tone warm, sincere. "Thank you for inviting me." And then I did nothing. The check remained where it was, unopened, untouched, its presence now impossible to ignore. The silence deepened, stretching across the table, filling the space between us with something new, something unfamiliar. For the first time in years, the pattern had broken. And no one knew quite what to do next. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a thread. Being pulled from fabric that had always seemed seamless until that very moment. Vanessa's smile remained in place, but it no longer reached her eyes, and for the first time that evening, she shifted in her seat, her posture adjusting as if something beneath her had become slightly unstable. Daniel exhaled quietly, a sound so small it might have gone unnoticed if the room had not already grown so still. He glanced at the check, then at me, then back at Vanessa, as though waiting for one of us to restore the order he had always relied on. No one moved. I folded my hands gently in my lap, the motion calm, deliberate, final in a way that did not need to be announced. Around us, the guests began to react in subtle, careful ways. A woman near the end of the table reached for her glass again, taking a sip she did not need. A man across from her adjusted his jacket, clearing his throat softly, as if preparing to speak and then deciding against it. The server hovered at a respectful distance, her presence attentive but restrained, trained to read a table without intruding upon it. She was waiting for a signal that no longer seemed certain. Vanessa let out a light laugh, a little too bright, a little too quick, the kind of sound meant to smooth over something that could not quite be ignored. "Oh, come on," she said, her tone playful, as if the moment were nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. "Let us not make this awkward." The word awkward lingered in the air, soft and inadequate, like a label placed over something far more significant. I tilted my head slightly, considering her, my expression unchanged. "I am not the one making it awkward," I replied, my voice even, steady, carrying no sharpness, no accusation, just a quiet statement of fact. The table seemed to absorb the words, holding them for a second longer than necessary before letting them settle. Daniel leaned forward then, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his voice careful, measured. "Mom," he said, the words sounding both familiar and distant at the same time. Everyone is here, and it is a celebration. We can figure this out later." Later. The suggestion was gentle, reasonable, designed to restore comfort without addressing the cause of its absence. I looked at him, really looked at him, noticing the lines that had formed around his eyes, the way his expression carried both expectation and unease. He had grown into a man who avoided discomfort, who smoothed things over, who relied on patterns to keep everything in place. And I had helped create those patterns. I had made it easy. For him. For them. "There is nothing to figure out later," I said softly. My tone did not rise, did not fall, it simply existed, clear and unyielding in its calm. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, the movement small but unmistakable. "Margaret," she said, her voice losing a fraction of its warmth, "it is just dinner. We are not talking about anything complicated." I met her gaze again, holding it just long enough to let the moment register. "No," I said, "we are not." The simplicity of the response seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. She blinked once, her composure flickering, then straightened slightly, her smile returning, though it felt more deliberate now, more constructed. "Then I do not understand," she continued, her tone sharpening just enough to reveal the edge beneath it. "This is how it has always been." Always. The word carried more weight than she intended, more truth than she realized. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but to give the moment space to settle into clarity. "Yes," I said quietly. "It has." And then I let the silence return, not filling it, not softening it, allowing it to stand on its own. Around the table, the guests began to shift more noticeably now, the discomfort no longer something that could be ignored. A man near the center reached for the check, then stopped, his hand hovering briefly before retreating. Someone else whispered something to their neighbor, their voices low but urgent, as if trying to interpret what was happening without being part of it. The server took a small step forward, then paused again, her eyes moving between us, waiting for a resolution that no longer followed the script she expected. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times when he was younger, when he was trying to solve something he did not fully understand. "Mom," he said again, his voice quieter now, less certain, "if this is about something, we can talk about it. You do not have to." He stopped, the sentence unfinished, the thought incomplete. I watched him for a moment, recognizing the effort in his words, the attempt to bridge a gap he had not noticed until it appeared in front of him. "I am not upset," I said gently. And it was true. What I felt was not anger, not even hurt. It was something quieter, something clearer. Recognition. Vanessa let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if my words had given her something to hold on to. "Good," she said quickly. "Then let us not turn this into something it is not." I inclined my head, acknowledging her, though not agreeing with her. "I am not turning it into anything," I replied. "I am simply not continuing what it has been." The distinction was subtle, but it settled over the table with a weight that could not be dismissed. Vanessa's expression shifted again, her patience thinning, her confidence beginning to adjust to something she had not anticipated. "So what does that mean?" she asked, the question direct now, stripped of its earlier softness. I glanced briefly at the check, still resting in the center of the table, untouched, unchanged, waiting. Then I looked back at her. "It means," I said calmly, "that tonight, I am a guest." The words were simple, but they carried something new, something unfamiliar, something that did not fit within the expectations that had defined every moment leading up to this one. For a second, no one spoke. The room held its breath, the shift complete, the pattern broken beyond easy repair. Daniel stared at me, his expression caught between confusion and realization, as if he were seeing something he had always overlooked. Vanessa's smile disappeared entirely now, replaced by something sharper, something more calculating, as she adjusted to a reality that no longer aligned with her assumptions. The server stepped forward again, this time more decisively, her training guiding her toward resolution where hesitation had failed. "Would anyone like me to split the check?" she asked politely, her voice neutral, offering a solution without taking sides. The question landed differently now, no longer rhetorical, no longer unnecessary. It was real. It required an answer. And for the first time in years, that answer did not belong to me. For a brief moment, no. One answered the server's question, and that silence said more than any response could have. It stretched across the table, settling into each person differently, exposing something that had always been there but had never needed to be acknowledged. Vanessa was the first to move. She let out a soft breath, her fingers smoothing the edge of her napkin as if resetting herself. Then she leaned back slightly, her posture shifting from effortless confidence to something more deliberate. "Oh, that will not be necessary," she said quickly, her voice light but carrying a new tension beneath it. "Margaret has always taken care of these things." The words landed exactly where she intended them to, restoring the pattern with a single sentence, placing me back into the role she believed I had stepped out of only temporarily. Around the table, I could feel the quiet release of expectation, the subtle way shoulders relaxed, the way a few guests allowed themselves to look away again, reassured that the moment would resolve itself as it always had. I did not move. I did not reach for the check. I simply looked at her. "Not tonight," I said. My voice was calm, steady, without emphasis, without apology. Just a simple statement. The shift that followed was immediate. Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly, but enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "I am sorry," she asked, her tone polite, but edged now, as if she were giving me an opportunity to correct myself. I held her gaze. I said, "Not tonight." Daniel's chair creaked softly as he shifted forward, his hands pressing lightly against the table. "Mom," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a note of urgency now. "Let us not make this into something bigger than it needs to be." Bigger. I considered the word for a moment. It was not bigger. It was simply different. "It is not bigger," I replied. "It is just different." The distinction seemed to unsettle him more than if I had argued. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, his expression tightening as he tried to find footing in a situation that no longer followed the rules he understood. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her composure sharpening, her voice losing the last traces of softness. "Margaret, this is my birthday dinner," she said, her words measured, precise. "Everyone is here because of me. The least we can do is not create a scene." A scene. I glanced briefly around the table, at the carefully dressed guests, the elegant setting, the soft glow of the lights reflecting in polished glassware. Nothing had been raised. No voices had been lifted. The only thing that had changed was expectation. "There is no scene," I said gently. "There is just a bill." The simplicity of the statement seemed to ripple through the group, stripping away the layers of politeness that had been used to disguise what was happening. The server remained still, her eyes attentive, waiting for direction, her professional calm now carrying a hint of uncertainty. A man near the center of the table cleared his throat. "We can split it," he offered, his voice tentative, as if testing whether such a suggestion was acceptable in this space. Vanessa's head turned toward him quickly, her expression tightening before she forced a small smile. That is not necessary, she said again, though her tone was less certain this time. We do not need to complicate things. Complicate. The word hung there, fragile, as if it might break under its own weight. I reached for my clutch then, not toward the check, but simply resting my hand over it, a small, controlled movement that drew attention without demanding it. Inside, the folded note remained exactly where I had placed it earlier. Just the wallet. I let my fingers rest there for a moment, feeling the paper beneath the fabric, grounding myself in the clarity it had brought. Across from me, Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes moving between Vanessa and me, her expression tense, uncertain, but no longer silent. It is not fair, she said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm enough to be heard. The table stilled again, attention turning toward her. Vanessa's gaze snapped in her direction, sharp, questioning. Excuse me, she said, her tone controlled but unmistakably cold. Emily swallowed, but did not look away. It is not fair to assume that Aunt Margaret should pay for everything, she continued, her words careful but unwavering. Especially not like this. Vanessa's lips pressed together, her composure tightening, her control slipping just enough to reveal the irritation beneath it. I think you are misunderstanding the situation, she replied, her voice clipped. This is how our family has always done things. Always. Again, that word. I turned my head slightly, looking at Emily, offering her a small nod, not encouraging her to continue, but acknowledging what she had said. It was enough. Daniel let out a breath, rubbing his temple briefly, the gesture betraying his growing frustration. Okay, he said, his voice firmer now, attempting to regain control. Let us just handle this and move on. He reached toward the check, his hand hovering over it for a second before he opened the folder, glancing down at the total. His expression shifted, just slightly, as he processed the number, the weight of it now his to consider. For years, he had never needed to. He closed the folder again, slower this time, his confidence less certain. Vanessa watched him, her expression tightening, the expectation now shifting from me to him, though neither of them had fully adjusted to that reality. Daniel, she said quietly, a warning in her tone, a reminder of the role he was supposed to play. He hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward me, then back to her. The moment stretched, fragile, uncertain. I sat quietly, my hands still, my expression calm, not intervening, not guiding, not rescuing. For the first time in a long time, I was not part of the solution. I was simply present. And that presence, without participation, seemed to change everything. The server took another small step forward. I can bring separate checks if that would be easier, she offered again, her voice neutral, professional, but now more direct. The option was no longer theoretical. It was real. It required a decision. Vanessa's gaze hardened, her patience thinning, her control slipping further as the evening moved beyond her expectations. No, she said sharply, then caught herself, softening her tone slightly. That will not be necessary. But this time, her words did not settle the room. They did not restore the pattern. They simply hung there, unsupported, waiting for something that no longer followed. Daniel looked down at the check again, then back at her, then finally at me. Mom, he said, his voice quieter now, less certain, are you sure? I met his gaze, holding it steady, not unkind, not cold, just clear. Yes, I said. And in that single word, everything shifted completely. The role they had given me, the one I had carried for so long without question, was no longer mine. And for the first time, they had to decide what came next without it. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that hesitation was louder than anything he could have said. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the leather folder, then loosened again, as if he were testing the weight of something unfamiliar. For years, that weight had never belonged to him. It had been passed, quietly and consistently, to me. Now it rested in his hands, and he was not ready for it. Vanessa watched him closely, her expression sharpening with each second that passed. There was no smile now, no softness, only expectation pressed into a thin line across her lips. Daniel, she said again, more firmly this time, the name no longer a suggestion but a directive. He exhaled slowly, glancing once more at the check before closing the folder and setting it back down on the table. The motion was careful, deliberate, but it did not resolve anything. It only made the uncertainty visible. Around us, the guests shifted again, the discomfort no longer subtle, no longer something that could be ignored. A few of them reached for their own belongings, not yet standing, but preparing, as if the evening had reached a point where its natural conclusion had been interrupted and no one quite knew how to move forward. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I was aware of every movement at the table, every glance, every small adjustment in tone, but I did not react to any of it. There was no need. The moment was unfolding exactly as it needed to. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, though it carried enough for those closest to hear. "This is not the time to hesitate," she said, her words controlled, measured, but edged with something sharper now. "We have guests." The emphasis on the word guests was not accidental. It was a reminder. A justification. A way of framing the situation so that it aligned with her expectation. Daniel nodded once, a small, uncertain movement, then reached for the check again. This time, he opened it fully, his eyes scanning the total more carefully. I watched the shift in his expression, the way his confidence gave way to calculation, then to something else entirely. Awareness. He had seen numbers before, of course, but never in this context, never as something he was responsible for. He closed the folder again, more slowly now, his fingers lingering on the edge as if he were considering his options. Vanessa's patience thinned further. "It is not complicated," she said, her tone tighter now, less polished, more revealing. "Just take care of it." The words hung in the air, stripped of their earlier refinement, reduced to their simplest form. Just take care of it. I recognized them immediately. I had heard them in different ways, at different times, always directed at me, always delivered with the same quiet certainty that I would comply. Tonight, they had been redirected. And they did not land as easily. Daniel did not move right away. Instead, he looked at me again, his expression searching, uncertain, as if waiting for something he could not quite name. Perhaps permission. Perhaps reassurance. Perhaps the familiar signal that I would step in and restore everything to its expected place. I met his gaze, calm, steady, offering none of those things. Not out of cruelty. Not out of defiance. Simply because they were no longer mine to give. The server stepped closer, her presence now more immediate, her professionalism guiding her toward resolution. "Would you like me to process the payment?" she asked, her voice polite, neutral, but carrying a gentle urgency. The question was directed toward the table, but her eyes rested briefly on Daniel, recognizing where the responsibility now seemed to sit. He hesitated again, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. The motion was slower than it needed to be, as if each step required thought, consideration, adjustment. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed slightly, a small release of tension, as though the pattern had finally reasserted itself, even if not exactly as she had intended. But something had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The ease was gone. The certainty had been replaced with effort. Daniel opened his wallet, flipping through its contents, his movements precise, controlled. He selected a card, holding it for a moment before placing it on top of the check. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that had never existed before. The server nodded, stepping forward to collect it. "I will take care of this right away," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, as she lifted the folder and the card, then turned and walked toward the register. As she moved away, the tables seemed to exhale collectively, the immediate tension easing, though not disappearing entirely. Conversations began to restart, hesitant at first, then gradually returning to a more familiar rhythm. But the energy had shifted. It was no longer effortless. It was no longer assumed. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her expression composed once more, though the brightness had not fully returned. "There," she said lightly, as if closing a minor inconvenience. That was not so difficult. Her words were directed at the table, but her eyes flicked toward me for just a second, as if measuring something, recalibrating. I did not respond. I simply sat, my hands still, my expression calm, allowing the moment to pass without acknowledgement. Daniel did not speak either. He remained quiet, his gaze lowered, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, processing something he had not expected to encounter tonight. Across the table, Emily watched him, then glanced at me, her expression thoughtful, as if she were beginning to understand something larger than the moment itself. I reached for my glass, taking a small sip, the coolness grounding, steadying, though I did not need it. What I felt was not unsettled. It was clear. For years, I had been part of a pattern that required no thought, no discussion, no acknowledgement. It had simply existed, reinforced by repetition, by silence, by the quiet agreement of everyone involved. Tonight, that pattern had been interrupted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just stopped. The server returned a few minutes later, placing the folder back in front of Daniel with a polite smile. "Thank you," she said. "I will be right back with your receipt." He nodded, his expression still distant, as he opened the folder once more, signing the slip with a hand that was steady, but slower than usual. When he closed it again, he did not look up immediately. Vanessa resumed her conversation, her voice brightening artificially, filling the space with something that resembled normalcy, though it did not quite reach the same level as before. The guests responded, some more easily than others, each adjusting in their own way to the subtle shift that had taken place. I remained quiet, observing, present, but no longer participating in the way I once had. The evening moved forward, but it did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something had changed, something small and quiet, but irreversible. And as I sat there, surrounded by familiar faces and unfamiliar expectations, I realized that this was only the beginning. Not of conflict. Not of confrontation. But of something far more significant. The moment they would have to learn what happened when the wallet closed. The dinner ended the way all evenings like that eventually do, not with resolution, not with clarity, but with a quiet unraveling that no one openly acknowledged. Chairs shifted, jackets were gathered, polite goodbyes were exchanged with just enough warmth to preserve appearances. Vanessa stood near the end of the table, accepting compliments about the evening, her smile restored but not quite as effortless as before. Daniel remained close to her, nodding, responding, playing his part, though I noticed how his attention drifted more often now, how his responses came a fraction slower than they had at the beginning of the night. I stood when it felt appropriate, not early enough to draw attention, not late enough to seem reluctant, simply at the right moment. I reached for my clutch, feeling the small folded note still inside, its presence steady, grounding, unchanged. As I stepped away from the table, Emily moved toward me, her expression soft, thoughtful. "Are you leaving already?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes. It has been a long evening." She hesitated, then gave a small smile. "I am glad you said something," she said. "Even if you did not really say anything." I returned her smile, understanding exactly what she meant. "Sometimes," I replied gently, "not saying something is the clearest thing you can do." She nodded, as if holding on to that thought, then stepped back, allowing me to pass. Near the entrance, Vanessa caught up with me, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Margaret," she called, her voice smooth again, controlled, though there was a tension beneath it that had not been there earlier. I turned, meeting her gaze. "Yes?" She stopped a few feet away, her posture straight, her expression carefully composed. "I hope you did not take anything tonight the wrong way," she said, her words measured, each one placed deliberately. It was meant to be a celebration. I considered her for a moment, noting the precision in her tone, the way she framed the evening as something that could be misunderstood rather than something that had been designed. I understood everything exactly. "As it was meant," I said calmly. Her smile tightened slightly, the corners of her lips holding firm while her eyes searched for something that was no longer there. "Good," she replied. Because we all appreciate everything you do for this family. Appreciate. The word sounded familiar, but it felt different now, lighter, less anchored. I inclined my head slightly. That is kind of you to say. There was a brief pause, a moment where neither of us moved, where the space between us held more truth than the words we had exchanged. Then Daniel approached, his steps slower, more hesitant than usual. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain. "Do you want me to walk you to your car?" It was a simple offer, one he had made countless times before, but tonight it carried something else, something unspoken. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the man he had become, but the distance that had grown between us, not all at once, but over years of small, unnoticed shifts. "No," I said gently. "I will be fine." He nodded, though the answer seemed to linger with him, as if he had expected something different. "Okay," he said. "Drive safe." I smiled. "I always do." I turned then, stepping out into the cool evening air, the sounds of the restaurant fading behind me as the door closed softly. The street was quieter, the city lights steady, unchanged by what had just taken place inside. I walked at an unhurried pace, my heels clicking lightly against the pavement, each step measured, grounded, certain. When I reached my car, I paused for a moment, opening my clutch and taking out the folded note. I looked at it again, the two words still as clear as they had been when I first saw them. Just the wallet. I held it there for a second, then folded it once more, smaller this time, before placing it back inside. Not as a reminder of what had been said, but as a marker of what had changed. I got into my car, closing the door gently, the quiet settling around me as I started the engine. The drive home was calm, familiar, the streets passing by in a steady rhythm that required no thought. But my mind was not on the road alone. It moved through the evening, not replaying it with emotion, but examining it with clarity, each moment fitting into place with a precision that had not been there before. The glance at the note. The laughter that followed. The expectation at the table. The hesitation when it was not met. The shift when it was not restored. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been new. It had simply been revealed. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it, quiet, orderly, unchanged. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the stillness settling around me. This house, every room, every detail, had been built over years of careful decisions, of steady work, of choices made with intention. It was mine. Not in a way that needed to be announced, not in a way that required validation, but in a way that was clear, documented, undeniable. I stepped out of the car and walked inside, the familiar scent of home greeting me as I closed the door behind me. The lights came on with a soft click, illuminating a space that felt entirely my own. I set my clutch down on the entry table, removing my coat and hanging it neatly in place. Everything was exactly where it should be. Exactly as I had arranged it. I moved into the living room, sitting down slowly, allowing the quiet to settle fully around me. There was no noise here, no expectation, no unspoken agreement waiting to be fulfilled. Just stillness. Just clarity. I reached for my phone, not out of habit, but with intention. There were no missed calls, no urgent messages, nothing that required immediate attention. That, too, was different. For years, my phone had been a bridge, a connection to requests, to needs, to expectations that arrived without question. Tonight, it was simply silent. I set it down again, leaning back slightly, my gaze moving across the room. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, bringing with it whatever followed from what had begun tonight. There would be questions. There would be conversations. There would be adjustments, perhaps resistance, perhaps attempts to restore what had been lost. But none of that concerned me now. Because something had already been decided, long before the dinner, long before the note, long before the check had been placed at the center of the table. And as I sat there, in the quiet of my own home, I allowed myself a small, steady breath, not of relief, not of regret, but of certainty. They had called me the wallet. And tonight, for the first time, they had felt what it meant when the wallet closed. The next morning arrived quietly, without urgency, without interruption, the kind of morning that did not demand attention but revealed things more clearly simply by existing. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in soft, even lines, settling across the living room floor exactly where it always did. I woke at my usual time, not earlier, not later, following a rhythm that had been mine long before anyone else's expectations had found their way into it. The house was still, the air cool, carrying none of the tension from the night before. I moved through my routine with the same calm precision, making coffee, setting a single cup on the table, listening to the quiet hum of the machine as it filled the space. There was something different in that quiet now. Not empty. Not lonely. Just, undisturbed. I sat down, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat settle into my palms. For years, mornings had been filled with small notifications, messages, reminders, requests that arrived before the day had even begun. A text asking if I could transfer money for something unexpected. A call about a bill that needed to be handled. A casual mention of a plan that, somehow, required my involvement. Today, there was nothing. My phone rested on the table beside me, its screen dark, silent. I glanced at it once, not expecting anything, simply acknowledging its presence. Then I looked away. The absence of noise was not surprising. It was simply new. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth ground me, steady me, not because I needed it, but because it marked the moment. The shift that had begun the night before had not been dramatic. It had not required raised voices or confrontation. It had simply been a decision. And decisions, when made clearly, have a way of carrying themselves forward without effort. By mid-morning, the first message arrived. It was from Daniel. The name appeared on the screen, simple, familiar, unchanged. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I let it sit there. For a moment, the notification glowing softly, not demanding, not urgent. When I did pick it up, I read the message once, then set the phone back down without responding. "Mom, can we talk?" That was all it said. No explanation. No context. Just a question that assumed there would be an answer. I did not feel the need to respond right away. For years, I had answered quickly, consistently, making myself available without hesitation. Now, I allowed time to exist between the question and the response. Not as a strategy. Not as a statement. Simply because I could. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, placed it carefully in the sink, and moved on with my day. There were things to do, not urgent, not pressing, but meaningful in their own way. I reviewed a few documents at my desk, papers that had been organized the day before, each one clear, each one deliberate. Accounts. Titles. Ownership. Details that had always been mine, but had rarely been considered in full. Yesterday morning, before the dinner, I had taken the time to look at everything with fresh eyes, to understand not just what existed, but what it meant. The clarity that came from that had not been emotional. It had been practical. Grounded. Final. The phone buzzed again around noon. Another message. This time from Vanessa. I did not need to open it to know the tone it would carry. When I did, I read it once, calmly, without reaction. "Margaret, I think there has been a misunderstanding. We should clear things up. Let me know when you are available." The words were polite. Measured. Carefully constructed to avoid any direct acknowledgement of what had actually happened. I set the phone down again, the screen going dark as the message disappeared from view. A misunderstanding. That was one way to describe it. Not inaccurate, perhaps, but incomplete. The day continued, steady, uninterrupted. I stepped outside in the afternoon, walking through the neighborhood at my usual pace, the air cool, the sky clear. People passed by, some nodding, some smiling, small interactions that required nothing more than presence. I appreciated that. The simplicity of it. No expectations. No roles to fulfill. Just movement, just space, just time. When I returned home, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. Daniel. The name remained on the screen, steady, patient, waiting. I watched it for a moment, then let it ring once more before answering. Hello? My voice was calm, even, unchanged. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had not expected me to answer so quickly, or perhaps not at all. Mom, he said, his voice careful, controlled, but carrying something beneath it. Uncertainty. Do you have a minute? I moved to the living room, sitting down slowly, allowing the space around me to settle. I have a minute, I replied. There was another pause, longer this time, as if he were choosing his words carefully, arranging them in a way that would make sense of something that no longer followed the structure he understood. About last night, he began, then stopped, the sentence unfinished. I did not interrupt. I did not guide him. I simply waited. I think things got a little off, he continued, the hesitation evident in the spaces between his words. Vanessa did not mean anything by it. It was just a joke. A joke. I let the word settle, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply allowing it to exist as he had presented it. I see, I said quietly. He exhaled softly, as if relieved to have reached that point without resistance. And the check, he added quickly, as though moving past something uncomfortable. It was just different. That is all. We are not used to, he stopped again, the thought trailing off. Not used to. I understood what he meant. I had not allowed them to become used to anything else. It was different, I agreed. The acknowledgement seemed to steady him, to give him something to hold on to. Right, he said. So maybe we can just go back to normal. Normal. The word carried more weight than he realized. More history. More assumption. I leaned back slightly, my gaze moving across the room, taking in the quiet, the order, the clarity that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Daniel, I said gently, my voice steady, unhurried, what you call normal has always worked very well for you. There was silence on the other end of the line. Not defensive. Not angry. Just quiet. I did not realize it had stopped working for you, he said finally, his tone softer now, less certain. I considered the question, not as something that required explanation, but as something that had already been answered. It did not stop working, I replied. I simply stopped participating. The distinction settled between us, clear, undeniable, leaving no room for interpretation. He did not respond immediately. I could hear his breathing, steady, measured, as he processed the words, as he adjusted to something he had not anticipated. So what does that mean? He asked after a moment, the question genuine now, stripped of assumption. I looked down at my hands, resting calmly in my lap, then back out into the quiet room. It means, I said, my voice even, certain, that things will not be the same as they were. There was another pause, longer this time, heavier, filled with the weight of something that could not be undone. And the business? He asked quietly, the question careful, almost hesitant. There it was. Not hidden. Not disguised. Just there. I allowed a small moment to pass before answering. What about it? I asked. He hesitated again, then spoke more directly. Vanessa said you were going to help with the funding. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, not out of disappointment, but simply to acknowledge the clarity of the moment. Then I opened them again. Vanessa says many things, I replied calmly. That does not make them true. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was not uncertain. It was not searching. It was understanding, arriving slowly, settling into place. And as I sat there, holding the phone, listening to that silence, I knew that what had begun the night before was no longer just a moment. It was a line that had been drawn, quietly, clearly, and without the need to ever be explained again. Daniel did not respond right away, and this time the silence did not feel uncertain, it felt settled, as if something had finally reached a point where it could no longer be reshaped into something more comfortable. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slower now, more deliberate, as though he were adjusting to a version of reality that did not include the assumptions he had always relied on. "So you are not going to help," he said finally, his voice quieter, not accusing, not defensive, just stating it. I did not rush to answer. I let the words sit between us, allowing their meaning to fully exist before I responded. "I did not say that," I replied calmly. "I said that what Vanessa told you was not true." There was a subtle shift in his tone, a hesitation that suggested he was trying to understand the difference. "I do not follow," he admitted. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze steady, my voice even. "Helping is a choice," I said. "Expectation is something else entirely." The distinction was simple, but it carried a weight that had been missing from every conversation we had ever had about money, about support, about what I provided and why. On the other end of the line, he was quiet again, and this time I knew he understood. Not completely, not yet, but enough. "Vanessa did not mean to assume," he said after a moment, his voice careful, as if trying to protect something that no longer needed protecting. "She just thought," he stopped, the sentence unfinished. I did not ask him to finish it. I already knew. She thought it would continue. She thought it was guaranteed. She thought I would always be there in the same way I had always been. "Daniel," I said gently, what she thought was based on what I allowed. The words were not harsh. They were not meant to assign blame. They were simply accurate. For years, I had created a pattern by responding the same way every time. I had made it easy for them to believe that nothing would ever change. "And now?" he asked quietly. I glanced toward the window, where the afternoon light had begun to shift, stretching longer across the floor, marking time in a way that felt steady and certain. "Now," I said, "I am choosing differently." The line remained quiet for a moment, then I heard him exhale, slower this time, as if something had settled into place that he could not move around anymore. "Vanessa is going to be upset," he said. I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of recognition. That, more than anything, had always been the center of his decisions. Avoiding her disappointment. Maintaining her expectations. Keeping everything aligned with what made her comfortable. "That is something she will have to manage," I replied calmly. The response was simple, but it shifted the responsibility in a way that had never been allowed before. For the first time, her reaction was not something I needed to anticipate or adjust for. It was simply hers. Daniel did not argue. He did not push. And that told me more than any response could have. He was beginning to see it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand that this was not a moment that could be negotiated back into place. "Are you upset with us?" he asked after a pause, the question softer now, more personal, less about money, more about something deeper that he had not yet fully named. I considered the question carefully, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted the answer to be as clear as everything else had become. "No," I said. "I am not upset." And it was true. What I felt was not anger, not resentment, not even disappointment. It was clarity. A recognition of what had been happening for years, and a decision to no longer participate in it the same way. "Then I do not understand," he said quietly. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. "You are not supposed to understand it all at once," I replied. "You are just supposed to notice that it is different." The distinction seemed to settle into the conversation, giving it shape, giving it direction without forcing it into something that could be resolved immediately. There was another pause, then a small shift in his tone, something more grounded, more present. "What happens now?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried everything. The business. The expectations. The dynamic that had defined our relationship for years. I let a moment pass before answering, not to create tension, but to allow the question to exist fully before I responded to it. "Now," I said, "you and Vanessa make your plans based on what you actually have." The words were straightforward, but they removed something that had always been quietly included in every decision they made. Me. And if we need help, he asked, the question careful, tentative, as if stepping into unfamiliar ground. I held the phone lightly, my voice steady. Then you ask, I said. And I decide. There was a subtle shift on the other end of the line, something almost like recognition, like the beginning of understanding. Not comfort. Not agreement. Just clarity. For the first time, the dynamic was defined by choice instead of assumption. Okay, he said finally, his voice quieter, but more certain than before. I think I understand that. I did not respond right away. I let the moment settle, letting his words exist without adding to them. Then I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. Good, I said. We sat in silence for a few seconds, not uncomfortable, not strained, just different. Then he spoke again, more softly this time. Mom? Yes? I did not realize, he said, the words coming slowly, carefully, as if he were saying something he had never allowed himself to say before. I did not realize how much of this we just expected. I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. Most people do not realize it, I said gently. Until it changes. The truth of it settled between us, quiet, undeniable. There was nothing more to argue, nothing more to explain. The line had been drawn, not in anger, not in conflict, but in clarity. I will talk to Vanessa, he said after a moment. I did not respond immediately. When I did, my voice was calm, unchanged. That is up to you. Another pause, then a small exhale. Okay, he said. I will call you later. Take your time, I replied. The call ended quietly, without tension, without resolution, but with something far more important. Understanding had begun. I set the phone down on the table, the screen fading to black as the room returned to its steady, quiet state. Outside, the light had shifted again, the afternoon moving toward evening, marking time in a way that felt natural, unforced. I sat there for a moment, not thinking, not replaying the conversation, simply existing in the clarity that had settled into place. Nothing had been taken from me. Nothing had been lost. Something had simply been returned. And as I sat there, in the quiet of my own home, I understood something with a certainty that did not need to be questioned. They had called me the wallet. But I had never been just the wallet. I had simply allowed them to believe it.